Okay, so we are going to talk about negative case debating today, which is my favorite part of debates. We'll talk about the 1NC, the block, and then what things look like in the 2NR, and hopefully we'll have some time for questions. I do not have a PowerPoint this time if you watched my last one because, I don't know, I hate PowerPoints. I decided that I was revolting against the system, so no PowerPoints. Okay, 1NC. You should actually have arguments on case. That's the first thing that I have to say here, and it's, by that I mean that you want to have a diversity of arguments and you need to be willing to actually spend a lot of time on it. A lot of people don't want to do this. They want to have just like 40 seconds on case because they need to read that 9th or 10th off case position, and just at some point those off case arguments are just massive diminishing returns, not actually very useful, not very persuasive, and so it's better to have case arguments. So you should have more case arguments. I think you should have at minimum 3 minutes of case in the 1NC. Ideally 4 minutes of case. Right, and so lots and lots of arguments on case. This is actually a pretty good time trade-off, believe it or not, because 2As love to get bogged down on answering case arguments. Because a lot of 2As just like don't write case blocks or don't really think about how they want to extend these things effectively. But it also helps a lot in terms of developing case arguments in the block. So lots of case, we love case. Place similar types of arguments together in the 1NC, and by that I mean put your internal link takeouts next to each other, your uniqueness or inherency arguments next to each other, your impact defense arguments next to each other, etc. You want to be organized, and that will make more sense once we talk about more of the block arguments, because one of the ways that you extend arguments in the block sometimes means that different arguments from the 1NC will become the warrants for other arguments later on in the block, and I'll give some more detail for that in a second. But in order to do that effectively, you want to place similar arguments, similar types of arguments next to each other. 1NC should primarily be cards. There can be some exceptions, but you should prioritize reading cards, right? Your job as the 1N, your job really is the 1N, definitely in the 1NC. A lot of times the 1NR is really just like head down read. Just like, don't think, just go. And you know, that kind of makes you a bit of a robot, but those are what the really, really good 1Ns will do, because you know, you should be fast and you should be able to get through all of the cards. And so primarily cards for the 1NC. Also, generally speaking, analytics become extensions of claims or warrants in your evidence, or they become reasons why the affirmative's evidence is bad, which you want to save those for the block, because obviously extensions you want later on in the debate, but then reasons why the affirmative's evidence is bad can become really useful extensions, really useful additional like depth to your arguments. So I think it's better to save those for the block, generally speaking. Offense in the 1NC, I think it's sometimes legitimate. I think it's only really good to read offense on case when you are really willing to go for it, right? So if you're going to DDev in the 1NC, you got to be ready to DDev for the block, right? Like, don't just kind of randomly throw out offense just for the sake of having offense on case. I think that's the equivalent of just like randomly throwing out another DA just for the sake of having another DA. And it's just not terribly useful, because especially with offense on case, because if the affirmative has prepped correctly, they will have thought about that piece of offense quite a lot. And so it's really useful only if you're like ready to go for it. That offense can be pretty short in the 1NC though, if you want to have it, like 1 to 2 cards or so, I think is pretty legitimate for the 1NC. But again, if you're going to do that, then the block's got to be ready to spend all of the time. So that's what I've got for the 1NC. Have a diversity of arguments, spend a lot of time here, probably 3 to 4 minutes. You want to place similar types of arguments together, right? So put your internal link takeouts near each other, your inherency arguments near each other, impact defense arguments near each other. Prioritize cards. Analytics should mostly be extensions of things, so you want to save those for the block. Offense, sometimes legitimate, only if you're really ready to go for it. Questions about the 1NC?
In K debates, like particularly like one off or two off,
Mhm.
on case, like I've gotten the comment that like it's been too defensive sometimes in the one and R. So like does the offense part how should you like integrate offense into case?
I think that when you're reading a one off or a two off K strategy, I think that I think the one NC you should still be mostly just defense. Like the best advice I have for case debating with a one off K is have case arguments about the affirmative that are not just about the critique, right? So like don't just stand up and read your security K card on case, like read internal link takeouts, to the one AC. And then when you're talking about it in the one and R, extend those internal link takeouts like they're just normal defensive arguments, but also have the added, this is a link to the critique, or this proves, X argument that my 2N said on the critique because blah, 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 blah. Or the only reason they think that this argument makes sense is because they exist within this problematic paradigm, mindset, etc., that is violent for some reason. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. That's how you make things more offensive for sure. Other questions?
I have a question as
Yeah.
well.
Mhm.
So 1NCs against KFs, what do you think are like the best regards to go like onto it besides just like framework cap K and then just like defensive claims on the AF? Is there like something better that we can do to actually like clash and engage with them?
Yeah, I think that you should read cards that talk about their theory and make arguments that kind of get at the things that they're saying. So, like there are, for example, pieces of evidence that indict Afro-pessimism broadly because, like, there are a bunch of people who say that it's a radically American theory, that it's a really, really Western conception to say that slavery has suddenly become such a global phenomenon that it explains how all violence operates. So, like, that's a really American ideology, and so that's problematic for various reasons. Or like if they're radically pessimistic about how the world works, I think reading optimism/reformism cards on case is also pretty effective. It's a little bit hard to say broadly, but I think the real answer is just like do research about that affirmative or do research about that theory and then figure out what people are saying is wrong with it and try and read those cards.
All right, thanks.
You're welcome. Other questions? Okay, so let's talk about the block. The number one best advice I can give you all is that you need to pick and choose arguments. Do not go for everything in the block. This like death by 1,000 cuts thing is useful when the 1AC makes no sense at all, but not very useful against well-constructed advantages. And so you need to be willing to say, I have this argument. I am going to spend about a minute or so on that individual argument. Right, so a minute on no US-China war, a minute on cartels will not collapse the Mexican state. Whatever the individual argument is, you need to be willing to be like, I have depth. I have spent a lot of time here. And this is one of the few times where I think it's better to spend more time than less time, because you can always, always, always have more in-depth warrant explanation while you're doing case debating. Because whatever the thing is that you're talking about, there are so many different people who have written about it from so many different angles, right? Like this idea of US-China war, yes, no, will it happen, has like 8 billion articles about it from a whole bunch of different people who have thought about so many different factors that could possibly happen. And so like have the depth, you have the time, spend the time, do it. Yeah, okay, I talked about the death by 1,000 cuts thing. I really think it's only useful against affirmatives that are like have a whole bunch of implicit problems with them. instead of thinking about death by 1,000 cuts as meaning here are, you know, instead of thinking about it as like, here I'm going to extend all 10 of my 1NC arguments, think about it as here I'm going to talk about 10 different warrants for one 1NC argument, or 2 or 3 2NC arguments. So the way that you want to extend things, and this will allow you to get some more depth. And Paris already knows this because she was in my lab at Georgetown, so this will be a good refresher for her. There's a couple different pieces that you want to have here. Number one is your claim, right? What is the thing that you think is correct? Number two, warrants. Why is that thing correct? Number three, reference your author. That's such and such. And that's, you'll notice, the third thing you do, not the first thing you do, right? Because the first thing that you do is you want to talk about your argument. You don't ever want to start your extension by saying, extend across my such and such piece of evidence. That's not the first thing you do, because you want the judge to be writing down the argument that you have said rather than the author primarily. So claim, warrant, author reference, evidence comparisons, and indicting. And by that, I mean, talk about why your evidence is preferable to theirs, talk about why, but talk about the actual cards, right? They probably only have one card from the 1AC, so this should be relatively easy to do and relatively easy to have depth on. So that was number 4. Number 5, judge direction. And by judge direction, what I mean is tell the judge what they should do with this piece of information. Even if it seems really obvious, like if you're extending no impact econ decline, still say, you know, this means that there's no impact to the advantage, so you should prefer our disadd or critique or whatever. And the purpose of that is oftentimes when we extend arguments, we don't, when we extend arguments and we don't have explicit judge direction, the judge doesn't know what to do with this piece of information. And like, that's not always true. Obviously, econ defense is a pretty easy example of when someone does know what they're doing. But like, I can't tell you all the amount of times where I've judged a debate and I've given a decision and then a team has started getting angry at me because I didn't vote on something. And afterwards, I just kind of look at them and I'm just like, I don't really know why that matters. Like, what do I do with that argument? How does that interact with what the other team has said? How does that mean this thing that I voted on is wrong? And so judge direction helps to alleviate that problem. So judge direction is good. You should tell the judge, what do we do with that information? And then after that, as the 6th component is, you want to read some new cards. The general rule of thumb is 2x plus 1, or the rule of 3. 2x plus 1, where x is the amount of cards the affirmative has read, or the rule of 3. And so what that means is to say, for every 1 card that the affirmative has on an issue, you want to have 3 cards total, at the very least. So you've got 1 in the 1NC, have 2 at the very least in the block. So I will repeat that extension. Claim, warrant, author reference, evidence comparison indicting, judge direction, new cards. If you've heard me talk about this extension thing before, I sometimes start by saying the first thing that you need to have is a they say but piece. That's just an argument reference kind of thing. How you start to extend is kind of up to you and up to your skill level and what you're comfortable doing. But generally, when we do extensions of case arguments, we don't say, you know, they say econ decline doesn't cause a nuclear, or generally when we're extending case arguments, we don't do something like, they say econ decline causes nuclear war, but econ decline does not cause nuclear war. Usually what we do is we just stand up and we're like, econ decline does not cause war. And then you start going into things. But just wanted to clear that up for people who have heard me talk about this before. Does that extension idea make sense? Does anyone need me to repeat any of those pieces? Okay. When you're developing arguments in the block, you want to develop warrants that both answer the arguments they have presented and answer the arguments that they are going to present. And by that, I mean it kind of doubles as you extending arguments and debating against them before they even present what they're going to say. So the most difficult thing about being negative, especially being a 2N, the 2NR is by and far the hardest speech and debate. Anyone who's told you anything otherwise is wrong. The hardest thing about being a 2N, giving the 2NR, is that you don't know how the 2AR is going to pivot, right? The 2AR gives the last speech. It's difficult to predict, here's what's going to happen. And so you want to, in the 2NC, to the extent that you can, predict those pivots and answer them before they have already happened, right? This is like some galaxy brain stuff. Like, you are predicting what's going to happen before they have even started predicting what they're going to do. And so you want to develop warrants that start to answer some of the arguments they're going to present before they've done so. And I'll give you all some examples that will hopefully help with this. In the block, you also sometimes end up extending arguments together, and that's okay. And by that, I mean that, I kind of talked about this a little bit earlier, but like, if you've got, so like your argument number 2 out of the 1NC might end up becoming another warrant for argument number 1. So if the 1NC, for example, reads the Dresner piece of evidence that says there's no impact econ decline, and then number 2 says global decoupling exists now. In the block, that global decoupling argument might become a warrant for no impact econ decline, right? It might become another part of that bigger extension. And that's okay, because it gives you more depth for the central claim that there's no impact econ decline. And then if you can, explain how your argument interacts with different flows and different levels of the flow, right? So if you've got an arg that takes out both advantages, say that it takes out both advantages, right? Make your stuff do double duty for you. It will make things so much easier for you. You can just be like, I got this one thing, and yeah, it answers this advantage. I've got this internal link takeout on this advantage, but it also takes out this other advantage. So like, you're debating against the drug courts AF that my lab is producing, and you're forwarding the argument that the opioid crisis is already resolved, right? It's just like not a big deal. That takes out both advantages, right? Because if the opioid crisis is resolved, we don't need to worry about stopping it for the manufacturing advantage. And then it also means that the cartels likely don't get their funding from opioids, right? And so make your arguments do double duty. Okay, I'll show you all some examples. Before we get there though, are there more questions?
Yeah, I have a question in regards to like extending things like framework coupled with actual arguments instead of making your framework arguments the case responses, if that makes sense.
Does that have to do with case debating?
Yeah, I kind of guess so. In regards to saying like prefer existential impacts over like soft left, how would you like couple the case arguments along with like framework arguments like that?
You might say that you might say that their inability to solve is another reason that we should prefer existential impacts.
So like try to sway the probability stuff and like the fact that they can't solve over to another reason why existential risk. All right, got you. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Share screen. Okay. So here are a couple examples. So these are blocks that I actually read when I was debating. First of all, you'll notice that for this 2NC block, there's a lot going on, right? So like I actually did spend the time to seriously sit and think, how do I want to talk about no impact econ collapse in the 2NC, right? I even timed it, took me 40 seconds, right? And so lots of time here. So no impact econ collapse, 2007 proves there's no incentive for rally around the flag or diversionary conflicts. So that's my claim, that's my warrant. It wasn't a total collapse, but it was large enough that there should have been some war if their theory was true, right? So that's another warrant, right? It was large enough that it should have been some war if their theory was true. But it's also a warrant that answers what the 1AR is going to say, right? So I knew that the 1AR was going to stand up and be like, they say 2007, but 2007 wasn't a total collapse, so it's not the same thing, right? So I've already answered what the 1AR is going to say. Next line here, none of their evidence speaks to a total collapse, but rather large downturns. So there's no distinction between their impact and our defense, right? Again, answering what the 1AR is going to say. And then there's no ev saying an economic collapse is coming now, so this is a low risk, right? So that would also preempt what the 1AR is going to say. And it also is another warrant for why we should not worry about economic collapse, right? So even if they win, there's going to be a collapse. There's not a collapse coming, so who cares, right? That's stressing. And then I always tried to leave some space between my author extension and then before I started reading new cards, because that would cue into me that I needed to do evidence indites in comparison, right? You'll notice I don't have that written here because I didn't know what the 1AC cards were when I was just like writing blocks in my downtime. And so that might be one thing that you all do. Maybe you want to leave some space here. Maybe you want to write in like do evidence comparison, indicting, like whatever it is that you need to kind of remind yourself that like that's really important. And then same thing with judge direction. Right, but you'll notice that also like I've got some judge direction up in here already, right? None of their ev speaks to a total collapse, rather large downturns. So there's no distinction between their impact and our defense, right? That's some judge direction, right? So this is a low risk, some judge direction, right? It's not the best, right? I was gonna need more of it when I got down here, but I got some of it in there, right? And then I would read 3 new cards because I knew that I wanted to go for no impact econ collapse. So I was like, I was ready to read a whole bunch more cards. So that's example 1. Example 2 is about warming. This block looks a little bit different than the block before, and I'll explain why in a second. But you'll also, the first thing that you'll probably notice is that there are a whole bunch more spaces between things. That was just because when I was debating, I generally, not always, but generally put extra spaces between things to remind myself to take a kind of brief pause, just because I like to go through things really, really quickly without giving anyone any pen time. And so this helps remind me of that. But so you can think of these spaces as dashes. So no catastrophic warming, temperature rise was predicted at 0.3 degrees Celsius. We've seen 0.1 degrees per decade instead, and even a doubling of current carbon would only produce 1 degree warmer temperatures, right? So that's a rise is not occurring and doesn't matter, right? And then we'd read this card. So there's all their models rely on faulty input data, which you all should probably not read evidence from Fred Singer because he's kind of a hack. We know that now. But you know, we'd read this card that their models rely on faulty input data. And then I would start doing more explanation of what the 1NC evidence looked like and how that compared with what the 1AC said. So the real reason that I've had this looks a little bit different is that there's a card before kind of going into all of these things is for the purpose of pen time, because I wanted the judge to write down all of my analytics here because I thought they were really, really important. But I thought, you know, if I just have all of these analytics and then more analytics immediately afterwards, that the judge, there's no way they were going to catch everything because because I was like pretty speedy as a debater. And so I put a card in between them for the sake of give them some pen time. And so that might be something that you could think about is if you think that you're pretty speedy or you've got a lot of depth associated with your case debating, then maybe try and separate some of your warrants with more pieces of evidence that explain what those warrants do for you. Right, so we've got that. Do more explanation. I had some evidence indicting written in here. I would rewrite it depending on what the 1AC evidence actually was. And then read more cards. Right, and you'll notice that this argument here about adaptation became a new reason why global warming didn't cause extinction. Right, we would read an adaptation card in the 1NC as a separate argument, but in the block, we read another piece of evidence about it becoming no impact to warming. Is this making sense? Do these examples help at all?
Yeah, they're pretty helpful.
Awesome. So that's what I've got for 2NC things. Talk about the 2NR for just a sec here, and then there will be plenty of time for questions. In the 2NR, again, the same thing I said at the beginning of the 2NC was that you need to pick and choose, pare down arguments. Same thing for the 2NR, right? So let's say the 1NC has like 9 or 10 different arguments. The block will have like 3, maybe 4. The 2NR probably extends to 2. Right? And if you're doing case debating in the block correctly, i.e. you're spending a whole minute just being like, here is all of the depth, all of the extra pieces that I've got, all of the intricacies to my argument, it will be very rare that a 1AR actually answers all of your things or actually does so sufficiently, right? Because the trick to the 1AR is, how do I get through things as quickly as possible? And oftentimes that means that the 1AR cuts corners. So you can, in the 2NR, if you have done case debating correctly in the block, pare down reasonably. The phrases, don't make me reinvent the wheel, and no new 2AR arguments. You should say those things once in the speech, but both should be said. Where you put them is really up to you. But I say it here, or I mention that here because, again, you should have a whole bunch of depth to your case arguments. And the 1AR is probably not going to answer a bunch of warrants that you've got. You don't want the cheating, lying 2AR to stand up and suddenly be like, OMG, here are all of our new answers, right? Don't let them do that. But you only really need to say those phrases once, because most judges all judges, I think. I'm going to say like 99% of judges are like on board, no new 2AR args. Evidence, indites, and comparison matter a lot more in the 2NR than they did in the block, because you need to tell the judge how to read the cards or how they should be thinking about them, right? They are within the next 5 to 10 minutes going to start thinking about your arguments, thinking about your pieces of evidence. And so you really, really want to have framed what those things are before the judge even starts to look at them. And then the last thing I have to say about the 2NR is just like, know your judge. Right, there are some judges who think that you have to have impact defense. There are some judges like myself who think that you can get away without only having impact defense, like you can just have internal link defense. But like, think about how your judge is going to think about the debate, and where are they going to start their decision, right? What is the first thing that they're going to think about, and then what other factors are going to go into consideration for them? So 2NR things, pick and choose, pare down. You probably don't want more than 2 different arguments on case. Remember, if you're doing case debating correctly in the block, this shouldn't matter because there's no way the 1AR has answered all of your awesome things. Don't make me reinvent the wheel and no new 2AR arguments are important phrases, but just say them once. Evidence, indices, comparison, really, really important for the 2-R because you want to tell the judge how to read your cards and how to read their cards. And then also know your judge in terms of thinking about strategy.